Hello and a warm welcome to today's HS2 live webinar, where we will be focusing on the archaeology of Curzon Street as part of the Festival of Archaeology. After the presentation portion of the webinar, we will have a live Q&A session where we will be answering questions about the topic of today's webinar. We will do our best to answer as many questions as possible during this time, but if we are unable to answer your question today, or if you have any further questions about the project, please do contact our help desk. Details will be shared at the end of the webinar. So before we begin, I wanted to share some technical information. All lines are muted, so you don't have to worry about any background noise. We don't anticipate any technical issues during our event. However, we wanted to provide some advice should you experience any connection issues. If your feed freezes, wait for about 10 seconds as it will most likely correct itself. If this doesn't happen, use the leave button to exit the call and rejoin using the event link. You will be able to use the toggle at the bottom of your screen to rewind back to where you left the call. You can also use this functionality at any point during the call should you need to pause for any reason. If there is a freeze or you disconnect and you are unable to rejoin due to a wider Microsoft incident, we will email you with further information. There is also a Q&A and comment function, which you should be able to find at the top right of your screen. And lastly, a recording of this live event will also be published on our HS2 YouTube channel after the event. Therefore, if all else fails, you'll be able to replay the live event in your own time. So HS2 will be the new high-speed backbone of our rail network, connecting the city centres of Birmingham, Manchester, Leeds and London. Once fully completed, we will have built 345 miles of new high-speed track, equivalent to over half the length of Britain from Land's End to John O'Groats as the crow flies. When fully operational, up to 48 HS2 trains with up to 1,100 seats each will be running every hour on the UK's rail network. This is a huge undertaking, Britain's first new intercity railway north of London in 100 years, and Europe's largest infrastructure project. Before we build the bridges, tunnels, tracks and stations, an unprecedented amount of archaeological work will take place along the line of route. HS2's Historic Environment Programme is the largest ever undertaken in the UK. We will be using over 1,000 archaeologists. We'll be telling over 10,000 years of British history on over 60 sites between London and Birmingham for phase 1. So I will now hand over to Emma.
Thanks, Laura. Hello and welcome to part 3 in our Archaeology of Curzon Street series. So in this webinar, we'll provide a detailed look at the latest results from the Roundhouse, and by using cutting-edge digital technology, you'll see how we use virtual models to explore places that our archaeologists can't safely go. And we'll also try to answer some of the latest research questions about Curzon Street. And if you've been following our results online or through our videos on YouTube perhaps, you may be wondering what more could we reveal? So our previous webinars have explored the archaeological results in conjunction with the astonishing accuracy of historic mapping. We've used 3D reconstructions and digital technology to reconstruct the Roundhouse and its different phases, and we've also looked at the impact that the incredible technology of the railways had on the people of Birmingham and the wider culture of the 19th century. And if you haven't yet had a chance to watch our other 2 Curzon Street videos, you can head over to our YouTube channel after this for more information on the initial results. And those results include the principal building and of course the social history and impact of the railways during the Industrial Revolution. So having gone over all of these amazing topics and results, it sounds like we've covered quite a lot. So what will this webinar do different? Now, in this webinar, we'll explore the research questions that drove us back to find out more, like our questions about the coke vaults and how they were accessed, And through these latest results, we can evoke the sights, the sounds, and even the smells of Curzon Street. And we'll also be able to get a sense of what the working conditions may have been like through our digital models of these wonderful coke vaults. So we do keep saying in all of our webinars that Curzon Street is special. And so we really have to understand it better to know why it's important. So first, let's take a peek behind the archaeological curtain and see just how different it is excavating industrial archaeology compared to the majority of the results you may have seen from our other HS2 webinars when we look at the more rural sites along the route of HS2. So what are the differences then between industrial archaeology, like the image on the left, compared to the quite mysterious prehistoric features on the right? And how are those differences important for understanding the further results at Curzon Street? So I'll start first with something that unites us both, and both sites rather, and that is the HERDS. So all of our excavations are guided by the HERDS, which is the Historic Environment Research and Delivery Strategy. It's an incredible document and it basically gives us excavation with a purpose. And it's also a document that you can look up online if you're interested. Now, in each of these pictures, they're very dynamic, aren't they? We can see the brick wall on the left from Curzon Street having that lovely boundary angle, and then the image on the right, we can see these beautiful pits, which is a Iron Age pit alignment or boundary feature at a site in Coleshill. So when we look at these, we can really see the juxtaposition between Curzon Street and the results of the other rural sites. So let's take a closer look at our recording methods for reconstructing rural archaeology on the nearby site at Coleshill. So as archaeologists, our aim is to interpret a site. So we know who lived on the land, what their lives were like, and to make contributions to those ever important research objectives. But to do that, we must know what came first. And this is where stratigraphy, which is quite a fun word to say, it comes into play because it's so important. So stratigraphy is really the building blocks of our interpretation and our analysis. So when we look at this pit, this is a lovely pit, part of that wider pit alignment. We can see that first fill on the bottom. So I can see this because I'm an archaeologist, but I hope that you can too. If you want to get your eye in, look at all those little rocks on the bottom. They kind of form that first layer. So we're looking at the different colours and the different layers as they give us clues about the events as to how that feature was backfilled. So the Iron Age pit that we're looking at here forms part of a pit alignment, and that's basically a series of pits in a line. At this site at Coleshill is nearly 300 metres long, and we think it forms part of a political or land boundary, which was part of an enclosed settlement. So really that word stratigraphy is important here, but what does it mean? So stratigraphy is the term used to describe the order in which soil layers or fills or even cut features were created. Now we can see in this image here that each layer or fill or feature is given a context number taken from our context index, and it is this number that is used to create a matrix, which is essentially just a flowchart showing the order in which each of the archaeological events occurred. It runs from the oldest or the first event to the newest or the last or most recent event. So in the example we see in section A, the matrix here, so we've got our very earliest event is 106, which is the natural geological horizon, moving on to the cut of our lovely pits, and then context numbers 103, 104 and 105 are the different sequences in which that feature was backfilled. So we're starting to build a picture of how that pit was used and how it fell out of use as well. So let's see what this looks like when we encounter bigger features on larger sites. Now, in these next 3 slides, we're going to follow the progress of revealing a feature, interpreting it, and then finally synthesizing those results into a reconstruction. So let's take a closer look. Now, this is our trench. It's a lovely trench, and the silty black charcoaly earth is full of cracked angular stones. The stones are cracked because a human has put them in a fire, and you can really see that there's just a real mix of cracked stones and charcoal. If you were lucky enough to be one of our archaeologists to dig this feature, it's really hard on your hands because it's just such a dense thing. So the spread of burnt stones extends beyond the limit of the trench. So after recording, our next step is a wider open area excavation. So now that our team have exposed the limit of this feature, so the full edges of it, we've been able to identify it as a burnt mound, which is an enigmatic and quite common prehistoric feature in this part of the world. So we want to understand more about this feature itself so we can record it. We'll look at the different layers, so the stratigraphy, and we'll also look at what its role is in the prehistoric landscape. Now, if you are interested in burnt mounds, we've covered a few of those in our other HS2 webinars, so do head over to our YouTube channel. Now, with our excavation results, environmental samples and post-excavation analysis, we can then start to put all that together to reveal a reconstruction of the burnt mound in its original setting. And here it is. So these reconstructions rather, can help us give voices to the past and further our understanding of a period in time over 3,000 years ago. So from just seeing all those cracked burnt stones to synthesizing the environmental results from the data, we're building up a picture of what life was like. But fast forward for a few thousand years to the 19th century, and we have Curzon Street. It's pretty different, isn't it? So maps, plans, voices and views, and of course, the standing structures left behind give us different information compared to the prehistoric features encountered more commonly along the route of HS2. So let's take a look and unpick this image. It's basically a general view of the eastern extension looking southwest, and you might be able to pick out in the kind of back right of this lovely dynamic shot, there's the curve of that wonderful roundhouse. Now we can see on the left, there's all these different coloured deposits. So it's not just soil, it's perhaps part of the archaeological story that we can unpick and unravel. So the different colours there, we've got perhaps some demolished brick that they've used to backfill it. We've got some other industrial deposits like coke and clinker. So if you're not sure what those are, don't worry, they're often terms that we can use quite often. So clinker is a waste byproduct, and it's the general name given for waste from an industrial process, and it particularly processes that involve smelting metals, welding, burning fossil fuels, so it can start to give us an idea of what they're doing in the area. And we can also see here that we've got different levels from the brick features themselves. So we've got these upstanding structures, different types of bricks. So how does it look like? So how does all that look when we go back to our stratigraphy model? So we can immediately see how the presence of a structure complicates matters. And we can look here about the different, how that wall comes up. We've got those different layers of the deposits there. So as I mentioned before, that stratigraphy is the building blocks of our interpretation. And for us to be able to delve deep into the past, we must understand its roots. But often, like on industrial sites, this presents us with obstacles. So I mentioned before about all those other different layers and deposits. It's really interesting to find those out. So now that we've explored the different types of archaeology and also the juxtaposition between rural and industrial sites, let's get right in there and explore the very latest results from the roundhouse at Curzon Street. Now, in a moment, I'll be joined by Jessica, who's going to take us through the detailed results of the excavation. And she'll also reveal how this rather abstract point cloud unlocks some of the answers to the big research questions at Curzon Street. So now, Jessica, over to you.
Thanks for that, Emma. Hi, everyone. I'm Jessica, community archaeologist from Headland Archaeology, So, as Emma mentioned, this webinar follows on from our previous one in the series that discussed the works at Curzon Street, and specifically the excavation of the Curzon Street Roundhouse. The excavations were located in the centre of Birmingham, and the site is circled on the map for you here. So we'll just have a quick overview of what we've recovered so far, just in case some of you haven't seen the previous webinar. Here you can see the foundations for the front building of the roundhouse, moving towards the central area where the trains were stored between shifts, and the circular foundation which would have held the turntable for turning the engines in the direction of either the bays for storage or out onto the line at the start of their shift. The front building looks quite low compared to the roundhouse, but what you can actually see is the basement level of the building, along with two circular structures which probably represent the remains of a pair of spiral staircases leading down into this basement level. Excavations were carried out from February to April in 2020, after previous trial trenching had confirmed the location and preservation status of the roundhouse structure. We already knew it was going to be there, we just didn't think that the remains of the building after its demolition would have been this well preserved. As you can see, it's quite an extensive structure, with not only the main foundation surviving, but also, in some parts, the lower levels of walls, a series of roof supports, and even a network of culverts for drainage purposes. On the whole, a fantastic site to excavate with a lot of potential to reveal interesting information, not only about the construction of the building, but also about later additions or alterations before its untimely demolition, after only around 20 years in operation. Not only is this site a fantastic archaeological excavation, but the roundhouse itself is hugely important. Curzon Street Station was the first railway terminus to serve the centre of Birmingham, initially providing a passenger service as part of the London and Birmingham Railway. The roundhouse, designed by Robert Stephenson and built in 1837, formed part of the early main line station yard. Railway roundhouses were designed so that engines could be stored between and easily prepared for their working shifts. Roundhouses are not uncommon in the UK, and there are two examples that are still standing today. Barrow Hill Roundhouse in Derby opened in 1870, which is the only surviving operational roundhouse in the UK. And a further roundhouse located in Camden was pictured in 1847 and transformed into a performing arts centre in the 1960s. The Curzon Street Roundhouse not only predates these two surviving examples, but it is believed to be the oldest known railway roundhouse in the UK and might even be the oldest known example in the world. This is why information about this particular building is not only interesting, but really important. You can see the surviving roundhouse from Camden pictured here. There is a wealth of information on the history of early mainline rail services in the UK, and not only do we have maps, engravings, and even photographs of the site, but we are also really lucky to have detailed architects' drawings and plans of the roundhouse building itself. Together with the excavated evidence of the roundhouse from the first phase of works, we even have enough information to put together models of what we think the building may have looked like before and after the roof was remodelled. So you might be wondering why we did any further works. Well, included in this wealth of detailed background information are some historic accounts and descriptions of the roundhouse, which give us keen insight into how the building would have looked and how it functioned, as well as how people interacted with it. One description from LeCount in 1839 details the roundhouse, which he refers to as the engine house, as well as some further tantalising information. The locomotive engine house is a building with 16 sides, capable of holding 16 engines and tenders, or 32 engines alone. Under each engine is a pit about 3 feet deep, which enables the engine men to get underneath the engine to examine, clean or repair it. The engine house is built on land about 20 feet lower than the present surface, under which are storerooms for coke and a communication to a large coke vault underground, which opens out to the canal. This account gives us a stark contrast to our more modern trains in terms of maintenance and safety. A further historical account from Wishaw goes into great detail and describes the coke vault being 300 feet long, 30 feet wide, and 20 feet high, containing tracks which led from the vault along a tunnel to the access shafts, which fed up into the roundhouse at either side of the line out to the station. So even though we'd revealed most of the roundhouse structure, we still had some unanswered questions, particularly about the vaults and voids that were hidden out of sight. The main aim of the further works at the site was to investigate these subsurface remains. There were two main reasons for this investigation. Firstly, exploring these areas might answer some of our research questions about the roundhouse. The main research themes for all investigations along the route of HS2 are outlined in the Written Scheme of Investigation Historic Environment Research Strategy. The research theme relevant to our excavations here at Curzon Street pertains to identifying key changes in the technology of railway infrastructure and how these changes influence the distribution of goods or the movement of people. More specifically, targeted background research highlighted the need to ascertain whether there was evidence that the way coke was supplied to the roundhouse, stored there and loaded onto the locomotive tenders. And for those non-train experts among us, including myself, the tender is a dedicated car that travels behind the engine, carrying all the fuel and water required for the journey. The second reason behind investigating the vaults and voids further was to better inform the backfill strategy for the site. Not only is leaving a site with subsurface, potentially cavernous voids not a very safe and stable way of leaving a heritage asset, but locating the vault was imperative before the construction of the new station can begin. Those of you that attended the last webinar may remember John Millward, the Historic Environment Manager for HS2, pointing out where we thought the remains of the coke vault were located. But for those of you just joining us, the location on the aerial photograph is circled in the bottom left of your screen. So as you can see from the large photograph in the background, we managed to identify a section of wall in an exploratory trench in this location. This was part of a subsurface wall beginning to curve at its uppermost part, indicating the presence of a barrel vaulted roof. On investigation of the subsurface wall, a large portion of it was preserved, and with more of it exposed, you can easily see the curve of the sprung arch for the barrel vaulted roof. The structure lay over 3 meters lower than the present ground surface, so unfortunately it was not possible to be able to remove the infill and explore its depths. We did, however, reveal as much of it as possible to investigate its size. Although the width of the vault appears to be consistent with the contemporary account, if we project its documented size from the back wall that we found of the vault towards the canal, it appears to put its length a little shorter than the records. Initially, the coke that fed the engines was supplied to the station using the canals. Although the current railway, built long after the demolition of the roundhouse, obscures our vision of the canal now, we can still visualise how the coke would make its way along the canal by barge and dock at a landing platform level with the canal itself. The coke would then be loaded into the vault and make its way up to the roundhouse. Much later, this vital resource would be transported by the railways themselves, but these early mainline services, such as the London and Birmingham Railway, did not yet have established rail routes to the collieries. Access from the vault to the roundhouse took the form of a tunnel, as detailed in the historic account. The tunnel was easier to locate, especially after confirming the location of the vault, although obviously initially you couldn't assume that that would have been a straight line. You can see the access shafts in the image shown here. The tunnels are just as important as the vault itself, providing the key infrastructure needed to transport the coke to the roundhouse. The last piece of the puzzle was to uncover where the tunnel connected to the vault. Uncovering this section of tunnel allowed us to see the roof structure from the outside, as parts which lie under the roundhouse are not accessible without damaging the structure. Although it wasn't possible for health and safety reasons to excavate inside the tunnels, An internal depth was recorded from one of the clearest shaft locations of around 2.7 metres. Here you can see a survey plan of the site showing the large curved vault wall in the bottom left of the screen. We know from the documentary sources that the base of the coke vault was laid with cart tracks leading from the landing platform to a turntable inside the vault, which was in line with the tunnel. From there, the carts of coke would be transported along the tunnel to the shafts and up into the roundhouse to be loaded onto the tenders. Although we couldn't excavate inside the tunnels to reveal what they would have been like to work in, there are some ways that we can explore places like this safely to record the archaeology. This is a point cloud model of the interior of the tunnels under the roundhouse, created by Visualising Heritage. You can see the shaft openings as circular features in the cloud. The model was created by lowering a laser scanner into the shaft and using it to record points along the tunnel's interior. That's what each of those tiny white dots is, a laser scanned measurement. The laser can record those places that aren't safe for us to access. The model can then be manipulated and turned to give us different angles showing how the tunnel connects to the shafts. Models like these not only create a great scientific record of the structure below the ground, but give us a little insight into what it would have been like to work in these tunnels. The image you can see now is a view from one end of the scanned model to the other, looking down the tunnel's length. We also use the laser scanner to record points on the surface. Layering photographs over the point cloud model can give us a 3D model of the site, which was also created by Visualising Heritage. And this is useful for anywhere that was accessible with a camera. This model can also be manipulated and turned. This allows us to inspect harder to reach areas of the site without compromising our health and safety. The point cloud and the photogrammetry models add to the written and photographic data to create a more comprehensive record of the structures and how they interact. With these, we've added a valuable contribution to our research question about how the coke was moved from the canal to the vault and up into the engine tenders inside the roundhouse. We can now show you a little of what they look like and better understand what it would have been like to work inside them. We can't answer this question fully without excavating the site in full, but that would mean undermining and removing parts of the roundhouse structure. This would only be possible if the roundhouse was going to be removed to make way for the construction of the new station. However, the Stevenson Roundhouse, along with its vault and tunnels, will be preserved in situ. The sensitive open spaces have been backfilled with inert sand to prevent any further damage and decay to this historic site. Unlike some of the sites commercial archaeologists usually excavate, like Coleshill for example, which will be preserved by record, the Curzon Street Roundhouse will be preserved in its original location below the ground. Although it is no longer physically accessible, it will be accessible to everyone for many generations via the record and these digital models.
Fantastic. So that was just absolutely fascinating. I've got quite a few questions that I want to know more about the wonderful excavations. So in a moment, I'm going to be joined by Anthony, who had the scintillating opportunity of being one of the archaeologists who was actually on the site excavating. So Anthony, are you there with me?
I am here, Emma, yes.
Okay, so I'm going to pick your brains now. But if you're part of our audience, if you've got some questions about some of the sites that we've been talking about, pop them in the chat as we'll go to that later. So one of the first things I'd like to ask you is that were you able to get a feel for what the working conditions would have been like during your time on site?
Yes, for sure. I mean, although we couldn't excavate the coke vault and actually get into it, it wasn't difficult to imagine and to look at the laser scan model what the conditions would actually have been like in there. The tunnel contained carts that were probably pushed by humans, and it was pretty narrow. There were brackets for gas lamps in the tunnels themselves, but they would have been poorly illuminated and probably pretty choky, pretty grim to work in. And also, it was leading from the canal. The tunnel was also very likely to be damp. So it isn't hard to imagine that the underground work in here was laborious, cold, and wet. Also, the main excavation of the roundhouse itself, the turntable and the pits, you know, there's descriptions of the pits being 3 feet deep, which is not a lot of room to move around if you're making repairs on a train. So in sum, the excavation revealed that the working conditions were probably deafening, cramped, dirty, with backbreaking work involved.
Wow. It sounds, one of the things that I like about industrial archaeology is that you can really get an idea for just how visceral those conditions were. So what really presented the biggest challenges, but also the biggest rewards for you whilst you're on site?
Well, there were several challenges on site. Firstly, the actual machining of the site itself. There was up to 2 to 3 meters of overburden, demolition, industrial waste over the actual roundhouse. So this is a logistical challenge for everybody. When operating, like the machine drivers and the archaeologists had to work together in tandem very carefully to uncover the layers of the roundhouse still intact, which is not as easy as it looks when you've got a 21-ton machine doing your digging for you. There were also newer buildings on site. An old concrete packing depot was sitting on top of the roundhouse turntable itself, and we had to peck that out with concrete breakers before we could get down to the actual archaeology. So in all, just actually finding and getting the thing cleaned was one of the biggest challenges, but also in its own way, one of the most rewarding. But from an archaeological point of view, it was the fact that the data we got back was so accurate. Our evaluation data from before we actually started the big excavation, where it showed us that the archaeology we'd seen in glimpses within trial pits was exactly where we imagined the roundhouse would be. The site survey, after we'd cleaned and excavated everything, overlaid almost perfectly with the scaled Victorian drawings and showed the amazing preservation of this site. The measurements given for the size of buildings are perfectly accurate to the remains uncovered on site.
It's fascinating, isn't it? When you get that synthesis of your excavations as well as the historic things, you just feel like you've completely unlocked the past and it's tangible. So did you already have an idea of just how special this site was or how special the roundhouse was actually going to be?
Well, we knew it was going to be a really good opportunity to excavate and study a unique piece of Victorian engineering, but the level of preservation was incredible and allowed us to really appreciate the size and scope of the site. And also, it made it very unique to excavate and record, as it's very unlikely that the opportunity to research this type of building is going to happen again. The technology of the roundhouse moved on really quickly after it was built, and so quickly that it became obsolete maybe 20 years later. So there weren't actually that many constructed, and the chance to look at one and see it in such a good state of preservation was, unique and memorable.
You're so lucky. I'm quite envious of your wonderful experience. And I mentioned throughout this talk, and we saw on some of the pictures, there's quite a lot of different types of rubble and backfill. And so was there any sort of interesting finds that you saw in that rubble and backfill of the site?
Yeah, there were. We actually found 2 ceramic plate fragments with some interesting stamps on them. So these came from the basement, and at first glance they don't look particularly significant, but actually they capture a very specific moment during the life of the railway. The plate on the right shows the crest of the London and Birmingham Railway. This London and Birmingham Railway was founded in 1833 and had a very short lifespan. It was only in service, closed in 1846, giving us a very narrow 13-year date range for this piece. The plate on the left reads the Queen's Hotel, and this is stamped onto it. This is significant as it was agreed on the 23rd of August 1841 to convert the boardroom of the main building at Curzon Street into a licensed hotel for a station. So this featured, accommodation, seating areas, refreshments, all the rest. On the 25th of September 1841, this hotel was renamed the Queen's Hotel, and an extension was built onto it at the same time. However, a new Queen's Hotel was opened at New Street Station on the 1st of May 1854, and the Curzon Street Hotel was basically eclipsed by this new arrival, with all passenger traffic moving to New Street and Curzon just becoming a goods depot. So the Curzon Street Hotel was then renamed the Railway Hotel and eventually closed in 1900. So both these plates show that the short lifespan, essentially, of the London and Birmingham Railway and of the Queen's Hotel in Curzon Street, and they can only have come from this site. They give us a terminus post-quem for the demolition rubble of 1840 and also highlight the rapidity of the technological change during this era, with the Roundhouse station and associated hotel basically becoming obsolete within a matter of years as a passenger destination.
That's absolutely fascinating that these two little shows of pottery can open up just an entire lifespan of what that building was doing and what people were doing in those buildings as well. So I'm sure people in our audience from listening to our little questions have probably got questions of their own. So let's open up the chat, and Laura's going to come back and give us a hand with that. So Laura, over to you.
Thank you. Okay, so we will now move on to answering some of your questions. As a reminder, there is a Q&A and comment function, which you should be able to find at the top right of your screen. We will do our best to answer as many questions as possible during this time, but if we are unable to answer your question today, please do contact our help desk. Details will be shared at the end of the webinar. So joining Emma, Jessica and Tony on the Q&A panel today is John, Historic Environment Manager for HS2. Hi, John.
Hi there.
Hello.
Okay, I'll just have a look at we just started having a few more coming in. Start with one of the questions we got submitted before the webinar. I think this would be a question for John. What are HS2's plans to reflect the roundhouse in the new Curzon Street station design?
Hi, yeah, that's a good question. It's actually sort of in a state of flux at the moment. So we put in temporary measures to keep it safe whilst we construct our new viaduct and railway station. But we've been thinking that obviously we've got to reflect this really significant piece of our heritage in the final sort of end state of our urban realm around the new station. Now, that hasn't been designed yet, but our design contractors are working very hard on that at the moment, so watch this space.
Hey, thank you, John. I think we've just had another question through. I think this might be another question for you, I'm afraid. So spaced around the turntable itself can be seen the individual inspection pits. These are quite short and would only be able to accommodate tank engines and not tender engines. This is why the roundhouse only stayed in use for 20 years, as larger locomotives with tenders attached could no longer be accommodated.
Okay, yeah, very technical question, but
yes,
we've actually got an answer from the historical sources about that. So you're quite right, a modern locomotive or even a sort of standard Victorian locomotive would be far too big for this space. It's only 124 feet in diameter. But the historic records actually record that it was designed for 16 locomotives and tenders, or 32 locomotives only. But you're right in that we're thinking of something more along the lines of Stephenson's Rocket rather than, you know, Mallard or something like that.
Lovely, very good knowledge there, John. Thank you. Okay, so one of the other questions we received before, I think is possibly a question for Tony. Were you surprised by how well preserved the roundhouse was, and why is preservation so good? But if anyone else wants to jump in and answer that as well, you're welcome to.
Yeah, it was surprising, but then again, a lot of the time when these things are demolished, there may be, we're looking at the lower layers of these structures. So the upper layers are demolished, covered, and the ground is built back up again, which quite often leaves, you know, foundations and these sort of structures relatively untouched. And because the building materials and the way things were built at the time were very, very high quality. Like even the channels for the pipes were made out of arched brickwork. So yeah, okay, the level of preservation is surprising, but it was an extremely well built piece of engineering, and also it was covered and almost like the lower layers were almost protected by the demolition itself.
Lovely, thank you, Tony. Let's have a quick look at the thread coming through. Another question actually that was submitted beforehand is question for John again. So what is happening to the old station building that was shown during the presentation?
Okay, really excited to be able to share this actually. The old principal building, the main building that still survives, it's Grade 1 listed, and HS2 are currently in the early stages of our refurbishment. So we're going to basically be able to repurpose this structure, so you'll be able to actually come and speak to people face to face on the ground floor about HS2 and our exciting project and its developments, and grab a coffee. And then the upper floors are actually going to be able to be used for youth enterprise with Birmingham City University. So really exciting. Hopefully, if you come back in a year, you'll be able to actually get inside, which is great because it's been derelict for far too long. And it's going to be a sort of crowning jewel of redevelopment of this area and reinvigorating this bit of Birmingham.
Thanks, John. Pretty exciting. Okay, let's see what else we've got coming through. The possibly question for Jessica, I'm not sure. How have advancements in technology helped your work as an archaeologist?
Advancements in technology. Well, obviously, that point cloud model is absolutely fantastic for being able to let us share experiences that we might be able to see on site. So if you're excavating something and there is a tunnel opening up on the ground, as the archaeologist on site, you might be able to just peek into the side of it, you know, without getting in it, and you'd be able to see it. But being able to take a photograph from a safe distance is not really going to be able to be shared with other people to give them an understanding of the spaces that we get to see. So being able to use things like the 3D laser scanners and be able to explore those spaces and give people that weren't on site or aren't able to access the sites, and archaeologists that aren't able to safely enter them, ideas about what they may look like and how big they may be, because we can get, you know, measurements from them as well. I think technology like that is just overwhelming. It's great. And even drone technology, taking photos from the air, or that wonderful fly through video, giving you a sort of understanding of how complex and large the site was. Those things really do help us as archaeologists to be able to teach people about what we do.
Absolutely, thank you. We create some beautiful images as well, like the ones you showed. We had a question through on the Q&A, just ticking through to find it. The last one was, this is a question for Tony, were any metal items found, for example, segments of track or the turntable itself?
No, there were very few metal items found on this site. The turntable itself, you're really only seeing the base of it. So something like that might have actually been taken away or ripped out completely. There was the Curzon Street Railway, the London and Birmingham Railway, was actually just next door to this site, the original one, and there were some sections of track left there. But of the roundhouse itself, very little fixtures and fittings or structural remain. There was lots of structural remains, but not metalwork or anything like that. Most of the time, you're just looking at brickwork.
Brilliant, thank you. We have another look through what's coming through. This possibly a question for Emma, but I'm sure others could chip in as well if they wanted to respond. So how did you get into archaeology and what skills do you need?
That's a really good question. My route into archaeology was perhaps slightly different. So when I went to university, I was obsessed with English literature and film, so I really studied that, and I had visions of going into old museum archives, looking at old books and thinking, oh, this is amazing. And I really focused on the 19th century. It's a real passion of mine. So I wanted to work in museums, perhaps look at rare books. Wasn't really a lot of jobs around when I graduated, and I was lucky enough to find a paid internship at Wessex Archaeology working in their archive section. So I spent 3 months looking at all these incredible artifacts that came from the field and boxing them up for museums. And then I was asked, oh, how do you feel about digging, Emma? I'm like, I've got no idea. Let's do it. And several years later, I'm still just as obsessed about archaeology. And it's just amazing that there are so many different careers in archaeology. So within this webinar itself, we've got people who work in community engagement, we've got site archaeologists and everything in between. So archaeology is a really vast career and there are loads of different ways into it.
That's lovely, thank you. Yes, it's lovely to think about all the different routes into it. I don't know if anyone else wants to take that question as well. Tony, how did you get into archaeology?
Yeah, well, I came through the route of going via uni, but it's definitely helpful to have a university degree, but there's lots of opportunities in archaeological sites at the moment in commercial archaeology. And for me as a project officer, you can be taught a lot of things on how to dig. A lot of it is about attitude. And if you have a good attitude on site, you will stick with the job. But yeah, it's important. Basically, you can get yourself in on student digs or on community excavations to give you an insight into actually how the practice works. And any little bit of knowledge you've got before you set foot on with an archaeological company on site will help you just to get the basics.
Brilliant, thank you. We've had another question which actually I think sounds really interesting. Do you think 20th century buildings, I'm sorry, this is a question for Tony again. Do you think 20th century buildings would have the same level of preservation in 100 years?
It's a pretty difficult one to answer.
Yeah.
I mean, I think, you know, buildings are built out of very different materials these days. And I can't actually say for certain whether they are longer lasting or actually are designed to degrade quicker. What I would say is that probably any demolition done on larger buildings in the 20th century is going to be far more. You might actually demolish the whole thing and restart again from scratch. I don't know. I mean, I'm not a building contractor, but it seems to me that these sort of buildings are preserved because of the materials they use to build them. That's not saying that 20th century buildings won't survive, but it could be that when they're taken away, their demolition is far more thorough.
Thank you. Very comprehensive answer. So let me have a little look through what else is coming through. Yes, I'm going to go with Jessica for this one, but feel free to pipe up anyone else that wants to respond. Have you ever found any written accounts, such as personal diaries, describing the working life of those working in the coke vaults?
Personally, while doing my research for this, no, I didn't find any personal accounts. Obviously, I read out one of the accounts that really described the buildings, but didn't really describe, obviously, what a personal experience would be in the way that a diary would. But if anybody out there is doing, you know, research, their own records and research in archives and does find it, please, you know, do send them our way, because they do really enhance our understanding of these heritage places.
Lovely, thank you. Yes, there's another question that's quite similar, sort of feeds on from that. Let me have a look. Possibly question for Jessica again. Something about what would it be like? What would it be like to work in the coke vaults? Did people have to go inside the vaults to shovel the coke, and was it dangerous?
Well, I think Tony mentioned, or might have mentioned, that there are light fittings down in the coke vaults and in the tunnels. So from that, we would suggest, yes, people were in there and they would have maybe, like Tony said, been pushing the carts, would definitely probably been used for shoveling the coal into the carts. So, yeah, it would have been quite an interesting experience, maybe quite damp, dark, you know, the lights might not have given off very much. Obviously it's level with the canal, could have been quite damp. So I would suggest, yeah, slips, trips and falls would have been pretty relevant on the health and safety aspect of working in those vaults and in those tunnels. So yeah, I think it would have been quite a dangerous thing that we would consider quite dangerous today. Yeah.
Yeah. So they didn't have all the risk assessments and things that we have to do now.
No.
Tony, there's a question for you. How long were you working on the site?
I was there between about 6 months from February, and then it probably took another, after that, someone else took over the site for me for another couple of months, right at the end when we were finding the coke vaults and things like that. So I mean, it was a pretty lengthy excavation, a lot of machining, a lot of demolition there to remove and store safely and have taken away. So these things, you know, just digging down to find the actual stuff is almost one of the easier bits. It's what you do with the stuff you remove that's hard a lot of the time.
Lovely, thank you. I had one more question that was submitted before. I'm going to say Emma, possibly for this one. How different do you think this area of Birmingham would have been when the Roundhouse was in operation? The wider area, I guess.
Oh, that's a lovely question. When we look at these historic accounts, and particularly with the little sherds of pottery, we get an idea that this is really like the place to be. It's one of the very early times where people can go to a railway station to go on holiday. So the railways completely changed people's lives, especially when you got that sort of the fun holiday journeys out to the coast. You can get really fresh fish and chips, things like that. So I like to think of it as a real kind of nexus for trade, for movement, but for social movement as well. So I think it would have been incredible. If you look at Birmingham New Street now, I've spent a lot of time popping in and out that station to get around the rest of the country, and perhaps it'd be something similar to that, but imagine we were wearing finer dresses and bustles and top hats.
Thank you. It's a really interesting description there. Vibrant. We have had another question come through. This was a question from before for Jessica. I think, are there any other opportunities for families and kids to get involved?
I think there'll be several opportunities for families to look at different webinars and things that we do as well, and hopefully we'll have further engagement for children. I'm not sure whether John has any more planned coming up, but we'll hopefully be able to do some more exciting opportunities for people to get involved with our work at HS2.
Thank you. We've had another question just come through on the Q&A. This is the question for John. As you mentioned, the site will be left in situ. What exactly will happen to the site to preserve it, and what will be on top of it? And what will happen to the Coles Hill site? So a couple of questions in there for you, John.
Yep. Smorgasbord. Right, so first off, I'll cover the Roundhouse and what we've done to protect it at the moment. And as I alluded to, the plans are a little bit up in the air in terms of the final state, but I'll give you some flavour of what we've got in mind. So at the moment, we've got some geotextiles and sandbags, along with concrete reinforced slabs protecting the actual Roundhouse. Then that's all covered in sand that we've had geochemically assessed to make sure it's inert and isn't going to damage or stain in any way. Over the top of that, we've then got various compounds and building material, basically to make sure we've got a nice hard surface. To give you some indication of how tough this is, it's about twice as strong as a standard road surface. So, we've put in a very high level of protection to make sure we can build everything on top. Once the construction works are complete, the original plan was actually to put a public garden over the top. Now, obviously, that will be subject to a lot of discussions with stakeholders now that we're aware of the very sensitive and significant archaeology below there. So we are going to try and work out a way of perhaps either referencing in our landscaping design the Roundhouse, or possibly even leaving a small section open so it can be publicly accessible going forwards. But we'll have to watch this space until the designers have had a completed design agreed with us all. Moving on to Coles Hill, although obviously slightly off topic, we are frankly not in a position to guarantee the preservation there, sadly. We'd love to, but it's just not viable given the expanse of our construction works there.
Thank you, John. That was really helpful. I think there's been a bit of a conversation about sort of some other things we could talk about what's happening. I think some stuff's popped in people's heads while you were talking, John. So I don't know if you want to go to Jessica or John to answer the previous question add a bit more detail in. Jessica, do you want to take it?
Yeah, so for kids and families to get involved with archaeology in general, they're definitely a good idea to look at your local Young Archaeologists Club, so your YAC clubs. There also, I think, are plans to include setting up a YAC with the core for HS2, and the core's social media would have more information on that, especially for sessions for 8 to 16-year-olds. Okay. If that helps.
Lovely, thank you. And I think we possibly have time for one more question. This question for Tony again. What was the strangest or best find that you had from this site?
Oh, strangest or best? Okay. To be honest, like because of the nature of the site, there weren't actually that many finds coming out of it. I would say that the best find was the actual site itself, the whole structure of it. When I was machining it back and we were cleaning it off, and you started to see it come together, the bays, the central bays, the radiating bays, then the turntable, and you're like, oh, that's a big round thing. That's got to be the turntable. And then, yeah, excavating that. I mean, unfortunately, there wasn't a lot of actual material cultural finds from it, but the roundhouse itself is a good enough find on its own to stand on its own, I think.
Thank you. I think this is our last question, actually. Question back to John. I think it's just feeding on. I think you've covered it really with the previous, but it said, why are we not? You had a question, why are we not preserving it and building over it? I think that's our last question, everybody.
Obviously, I can confirm we are preserving it and we aren't building over it because that seems sacrilegious from an archaeology point of view.
Great. Thank you for your response, John. Okay, so thank you all once again for taking the time to tune in today and for the questions. We've tried our best to answer as many as possible during the time available. If we didn't manage to answer your question today, or if you have any other questions about the wider HS2 programme, please contact our help desk, who are available all day, every day. We'd like your feedback on how we can improve these sessions. Please visit the link posted in the announcements or look out for an email from HS2 following this webinar. Thank you and have a great day.